We obviously don't agree on everything. That understatement courtesy of the U.S. Secretary of State. Now that Antony Blinken's weekend shuttling from Jordan and the West Bank to Iraq and Turkey are over, we can ask, what were they all about? That trip began with Blinken's fourth visit to Israel in as many weeks. It included a slow ratcheting up of Washington's call for humanitarian pauses, as the U.S. puts it, to spare civilian lives in Gaza. But as Israeli troops surround Gaza City, protesters like those outside Turkey's Incirlik NATO military base Sunday clearly don't see the results. What was the aim of Blinken's Turkey visit? And why did the country's president make a point of traveling to the remote northeast of the country just as the top U.S. diplomat was touching down? Not to be overlooked, Iraq's prime minister traveling to Tehran one day after Blinken paid a call on Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, with pro-Iran militias targeting U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria this past month. It's all a reminder that between Iran and its proxies on the one hand and the U.S. and Israel on the other, there's a wide range of stakeholders, all looking for a way to reverse a deadly spiral that risks drawing in the entire region. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if it's an impossible balancing act for the United States. Joining us from Istanbul, Sinan Ulgen, president of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies think tank. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
From London, political analyst Jamin El-Gamal, former Middle East advisor at the U.S. Defense Department. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're joined shortly from Washington by former advisor at the U.S. State Department, Jeffrey Stacey, the author of Full Spectrum Warfare. And joining us as well from the U.S. Capitol, he researches radicalism and factionalism, Hassan Mineh, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation you have on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The hashtag is F24debate. A frantic 5 days of shuttle diplomacy came complete with surprise stops and arguably the trickiest bit at the end. Charlie James has more.
Tough talks in Turkey as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken capped a frantic weekend of diplomatic visits. In a closed-door meeting with the Turkish foreign minister Monday, Blinken aimed to soothe anger over the violence in Gaza. Turkey is a strong supporter of Palestinians and has been furious at both Israel and its Western allies' support for the Jewish state. Before leaving the country, Blinken said regional consensus is a work in progress.
We're making sure that the different influence and relationships that countries in the region have, including the countries that I visited or spoke to, that they're using that to make sure that this conflict and crisis doesn't spread. And that's critical.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan did not make himself available to Blinken. Instead, he traveled across Turkey's northeast and continued to express staunch solidarity for Palestinians.
It is our responsibility for our Palestinian brothers to be saved from Israeli cruelty and for the massacres happening in Gaza in front of the world's eyes to be stopped.
Anger over Israel's offensive is as clear in the Turkish streets as in the presidential palace. Near the foreign ministry in Ankara, pro-Palestinian crowds protested during Blinken's meeting, clearly expressing their anger toward Israel and the U.S. The U.S. has been working to secure a humanitarian pause in Gaza and build regional support for it, but Arab players are pushing for an immediate ceasefire. Blinken's frantic weekend of travel also took him from Israel to Jordan, the occupied West Bank, Cyprus, and Iraq. But his diplomatic efforts appear to have had limited success, with no humanitarian pause in sight.
Sinan Ulgen, what was the point of Antony Blinken's trip to Turkey?
Well, first of all, the primary objective was to ensure that there is no further regional escalation. Turkey is one of the countries that has a diplomatic engagement with Iran. The Iranian foreign minister was in Turkey a few days ago. So it was, first of all, an opportunity for the U.S. State Secretary to get an account of what was discussed between Turkey and Iran on that occasion, given the importance that Iran has and the control that it has over the proxy militia groups like Hezbollah. So that was the first objective. The second objective was to see whether there could really be a regional initiative to essentially allow for a humanitarian pause. Of course, from the Turkish side, this is just too little. Turkey wants a full ceasefire, but that was essentially the second objective. Then there were also other issues that are on the bilateral track between Turkey and the United States, like the NATO enlargement deal, like the F-16 package that Turkey expects from the United States. There were also discussion about
and that's
the
where,
future
and
of Syria.
if I may, Sinan, that's where it becomes confusing for people who don't follow Turkey closely, because on the one hand, and we heard the clip of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in that report, a firebrand speech again where he denounces the U.S., he denounces Israel, and on the other, this opening to letting Sweden into NATO.
Yes, but this has to be understood in the context of Turkey being a NATO ally. But the fact that Turkey is NATO and it is a strategic ally of the United States doesn't mean that we see eye to eye on every regional issue, actually far from it. So this is basically where, despite being a NATO ally, there are core differences between how Turkey looks at the region, in particular now in the war between Hamas and Israel. But there was also the case previously during the war on Iraq, for instance, where Turkey was very much opposed to that U.S. intervention, just like France was.
Hassan Meneimene, is when Recep Tayyip Erdogan blasts the West, blasts the United States, is he doing it because that's what he believes in his heart of hearts, or is he being transactional?
Evidently, you would have to ask him. But nonetheless, I would say that he reflects an opinion, a point of view that has a lot of resonance across the region. And maybe that was part of the reason why part of the objectives of the trip of Blinken's visit to Ankara, which is to try to reduce the intensity. The goals of the whole whirlwind visits that he has had across the region are simple. I mean, the U.S. continues to be unequivocally and totally supportive of Israel, and Israel has the right to any decision-making that it sees fit, irrespective of any constraint that might be imposed by international law, and the U.S. has its back. That's the point of view that the U.S. is expressing throughout. So these visits all over the place have two goals, actually. One is to ensure that Israel is able to focus on Hamas by insisting on the U.S. interest of not having the war expand to the region. And I think that quite a bit has been achieved in that sense. The speech by the Secretary General of Hezbollah indicates it. The visit of Soudani to Tehran will confirm it, etc. The other goal, the other aim, is to test whether all these regional actors, including Turkey, would be amenable to assuming a certain role in the transition beyond Hamas. And here we're talking about whether they would be willing to contribute aid, support, whatever it is, once Israel finishes pushing the population of the northern part of Gaza to its southern part and finishes creating conditions of really humanitarian conditions that are not tenable. I mean, the responsibility there has to be pushed to someone. And that someone, if it is Turkey together with whoever else in the region, Egypt, Jordan, etc., if they're unable to handle it, in that case, the burden of accepting the movement of population, the expulsion of the Palestinians from the southern part of Gaza would fall upon them. This is why it's kind of here, we're not talking about a balancing act. Talking about balancing act assumes that the party trying to balance has the interest of everyone at an equal level, or at least under consideration. Here what we have is the United States, the Biden administration, acting as Israel's broker towards ensuring an Israel victory, whatever that means, and then ensuring that in the post-victory period, transition, that a burden will be shared by others.
Jasmine El-Gamal, we're seeing how it's tearing apart the left wing of the Democratic Party over in the United States. We've just had in the last minutes the White House stating that Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu have been talking about tactical pauses in Gaza. Do you agree with what you just heard from Hassan Mineh?
Thanks, Francois. Well, I think that there's, if we just step back for a minute and kind of try to understand the U.S. response and the U.S. support for Israel, where does it come from? Just so we can unpack that a little bit. First of all, obviously, of course, there's domestic political considerations in the U.S. I mean, support for Israel has generally been a fairly bipartisan issue in the U.S. across Republican and Democratic administrations. On the other hand, you also have President Biden, who, according in his own words and according to his aides, as was reported today in the Washington Post, that he has a strong affinity for Israel. He stands with Israel. He said that. He believes it. A lot of what he said when he was in Israel was not for the cameras. I mean, he truly feels personally impacted and affected by what he saw on October 7th, of course, as anyone should be. But there's a third aspect to it, too, which I think is the really important one here, because this is where I think the U.S. is failing at its efforts. The U.S. has always tried to do what it calls a bear hug to Israel, which means just a very public, very warm, very unwavering embrace of Israel in public, so that it can buy itself space and private to have tough conversations with Israel that it doesn't want to or can't really have in public. Now, that's what we're seeing failing right now, because if you look at the amount of public support for Israel that the U.S. has shown in the last month versus what concessions it has been able to extract from the Israelis, you see that there's a really wide gap between what they are asking for, humanitarian pauses. They're asking for Israel to be more careful in targeting civilians and preventing civilian deaths. You don't really see much of that happening. In fact, you hardly see anything happening at all. Now, Israel has allowed for water to be placed back on. It's allowed for some, really a meager amount of humanitarian assistance to be let into Gaza from the Rafah crossing. But other than that, it really has been pushing back against the U.S. quite strongly in a way that we haven't really seen before, just absolutely saying, no, we will not stop until we feel that we have achieved what we want to achieve.
So, Jasmine,
which, by the way, they haven't really explained what that is.
How should the U.S. be playing it in public?
There's a question, Francois, of should, and there's a question of what's realistic, okay? Now, I'm trying to talk about what is in the realm of possible. Now, if we talk about what should, the U.S. basically is Israel's largest supporter. It provides it with assistance. It provides it with arms. It provides it with weapons. Now, in a case of what we're seeing right now with this massive civilian casualties, the numbers that we're seeing that are so horrifying, the images of ambulances, hospitals, bakeries, schools, all of this stuff, what the U.S. should be doing in a perfect world is what we would do with any other ally, which is to say, listen, we're not going to give you a carte blanche. We're not going to keep sending you weapons and assistance until you assure us and until we see on the ground that you are not using this assistance and these weapons to target civilians. That said, because of all the reasons I mentioned before, that's not really going to happen. And so what I think we can be, realistically, what we should be expecting the U.S. to do is be much tougher in private conversations with Israel to say what you are doing right now is not achieving your goals. It's not degrading Hamas the way you want it to. In fact, Hamas has been largely untouched when it comes to casualties, Hamas casualties, as the Israelis, of course, we don't have numbers, versus civilian casualties. And also, it's making us go farther and farther and farther away from the real solution to all of this, which is the political solution, a pathway towards peace where two peoples can live side by side in dignity and safety. And that is not the path that Israel is walking towards, is not bringing it closer to that long-lasting peace. And that's what the Americans should really be hammering home. But I'm afraid because of the shock and because of the trauma that Israelis are feeling because of October 7th and the horrible attacks that happened that day, and because Prime Minister Netanyahu is so weakened politically, and because so many Israelis are blaming him for falling asleep at the wheel, basically, you won't see Israelis bow to American pressure anytime soon, I'm afraid.
All right. The Skype gods are not with Jeffrey Stacey in Washington. Nonetheless, he can join us by telephone now. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Do you agree with what you just heard from Jasmine El-Gaman that Washington should be doing more to pressure Israel?
Well, it definitely should. And I think that if we see, for example, another attack on a refugee camp like we saw this week, then likely the U.S. will get to that red line. It already should, probably, but it has, as my colleague was just saying, it has gotten a lot of pushback directly. My friend Antony Blinken in the region this week did not get the answers to the questions that he sought, and I'm afraid that is where we are at present.
Now, Antony Blinken has often been using, the line he's been using a lot this last month is what happens on the day after. We heard earlier Hassan Mene saying how that last leg of his tour, going to Turkey, part of it is to try to help broker some kind of a political path once the fighting stops. Is that for you what this Turkey trip was about?
Yes, but I think privately it's about even slightly more. They're trying to line up pressure on both sides from regional actors to get to either this pause that they're calling for, which is slightly different from a ceasefire. They're almost the same thing. It's hard to explain the nuance of the difference, but delimited in time and duration is what a pause is, specifically for humanitarian reasons. A ceasefire is an unending pause, essentially, and that's right now what the Israelis won't agree to.
Sinan Ulgen, your thoughts on the role Turkey will play going forward?
Just before that, I want to comment on what I heard regarding the U.S. position, because there's a major dilemma facing U.S. policymakers here. The U.S., the ill-fated U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003 was very detrimental to the U.S. image in the Middle East. And now this position of giving publicly a carte blanche to Israel with all the atrocities that are being committed, even some claim crimes against humanity, war crimes, is going to have a long-term lasting impact on the U.S. perceptions in the Middle East. Because ultimately this is a very blatant double standards. It runs counter to all the values that the U.S. has or wants to espouse publicly in terms of rule of law, humanitarian law, and so on.
So what you're saying is that the U.S. will not be Israel's broker indefinitely?
Well, I hope not, but so far it is giving the perception that it is. And this is very detrimental to the US image today and tomorrow. And this is something that I'm sure the Turkish policymakers shared with Blinken when he was in Turkey. And the second point that was most probably discussed is for the day after, where Turkey has already championed a plan similar to what is being discussed for Ukraine, which is essentially multilateral security guarantees for Palestine. Now, it may be too early to talk about this, given that we're nowhere near, let alone a political settlement or even a ceasefire. But nonetheless, there certainly also needs to be a discussion for the day after. And there's no really viable answers to that state as of now.
Sinan, why is it that we've been hearing a lot about Qatar in the hostage negotiations, not so much about Turkey? Turkey, which is part of, who's ruling AKP, is part of the International Islamic Brotherhood, same as Hamas is.
Well, because for the last few years, Turkey has distanced itself from Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. It is true that in the early part of the last decade, especially after the onset of the Arab Spring, Turkey engaged in a foreign policy where it wanted to invest in the relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. And it did so in a number of different geographies, starting with Egypt. But that policy has backfired. It has led to Turkey's regional isolation. It has led to a web of tarnished bilateral relations with the Gulf countries, with Egypt and others as well. And therefore, there has been a recalibration of that policy, which involved a distancing of Ankara from Hamas. So that today, Qatar has warmer, let's say, relations with Hamas than Turkey.
So Turkey, despite its fiery rhetoric, perhaps easing off a little bit on its support for Hamas. And we were mentioning Turkey, of course, was the last leg of this trip. On Sunday, Antony Blinken traveled to Baghdad. It was a surprise to sell his Mideast diplomacy and warn Iran-aligned militias over repeated attacks on U.S. forces stationed in the country as part of the coalition against ISIS. And while Blinken traveled to Cyprus and Turkey on Monday, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani went to Tehran with language tailored for his hosts.
Those who want the conflict to be contained and not spread to the entire region should pressure the Zionist regime to stop its military aggression and systematic slaughter.
Jasmine Al-Gamal, what's your reading? The U.S. Secretary of State goes to Baghdad, visits the Iraqi Prime Minister, who then goes to Tehran.
Right. Francois, I mean, all of this tells you, and it really shows you just how high the stakes are in this conflict. Every country in the region and the U.S. outside the region, everybody is so worried and so frightened that this might lead to an all-out regional war that no one can afford. A regional war doesn't benefit anyone, whether you think Iraq, whether you think Lebanon, whether you think certain actors like Hezbollah, whether Iran, it does not serve anyone. So what you see is this flurry of activity with people going around trying to strike that balance between deterrence and between stating up front that they don't want a regional war. So obviously we know that there have been attacks, repeated attacks in both Iraq and Syria by Iranian and Iran-aligned militias against U.S. personnel. At the same time, both sides, the U.S. and Iran, and the U.S. has retaliated, of course, they both are saying, we don't want a war, this war does not serve anybody, but, you know, beware. We are sort of ready. We're ready, but we don't really want it. So that's the message that you're hearing from everyone, even as someone mentioned earlier in the program, Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon just a day or two ago, when he said, we are prepared, we support Hamas, but we didn't know about October 7th ahead of time. And we don't want, you know, so there's this very delicate balance that everybody's trying to achieve in the region to make sure that this, in as much as it can be contained, is contained, but then also that the conflict ends as quickly as possible with a pathway to political talks and to peace, so that the temperature is dialed down quite a bit from where it is now.
Hassan Mineh, we've talked about a lot of actors here, some of them state actors, some of them non-state actors. The Iraqi Prime Minister, Iran, the Hezbollah movement, which is Iran-backed, Turkey. They're all in agreement. We heard it in that clip when it comes to denouncing Israel. Are they singing from the same hymn sheet, though?
Certainly they are, but let me underline here that there's a qualitative difference in the position of the United States vis-à-vis Israel in this round of conflict compared to the others. I disagree slightly with the colleagues about the U.S. trying to usher a certain restoration of the status quo ante, but with the modifications such as eliminating Hamas and creating a certain order in which regional partners will be represented, or at least will have a stake in order to counter Iran and its various proxies and allies in the region. I think that in this particular case, there is far more sympathy on the part of the United States to the maximalist Israeli view that this situation, this kind of iterations of conflict and relative lull cannot be continued, and therefore there needs to be a radical solution here. If Gaza, with 2.2 million people, was able to mount such an attack, what will happen when Gaza will become 4 or 5 million down the line? What will happen when Iran becomes nuclear? So there is a certain mindset across Israel at a majority level, and I would argue across the United States, still not at a majority level, I'm talking here about the administration, but nonetheless sympathetic to the notion that something really drastic, something really new ought to happen. What this is...
Wait, something really new can be something very bad, like flattening Gaza, or it can be something good, like trying to broker a political solution.
Well, exactly. The point of a political solution, the argument on the part of not just Netanyahu, who called it actually the second independence war. Let's remember what happened in the first independence war. There was expulsion of population. There was a conflict that was regional in a certain sense. And Netanyahu, again, invoking biblical precedents when he says, remember what Amalek did to you, meaning equating the Palestinians with Amalek, who by divine order, the Israelites were supposed to annihilate them, men, women, children, etc. We cannot ignore the fact that there is an existential crisis in Israel today. There's the feel that the edge that Israel had is gone. And all these attempts at basically showing force are not restoring it. I mean, if 1 month later we still have Hamas lobbing projectiles, regardless of how weak, how insignificant these projectiles are, but in terms of the effect on the Israeli sense of security, they are tremendous. So effectively, here what we have is a United States that evidently does not want to see the conflict spill over, and it wants it contained, but it is willing to see what Israel can do in order, A, to restore its sense of security and sense of deterrence, and B, what type of solution does Israel want? Does this solution involve expulsion of population? Clearly, this is not the US preference. But I have to say that this is now becoming more and more standard language in Israel to talk about what to do with Gaza next and which part of Gaza, etc. So I think we are here, we have entered uncharted territory in terms of how to manage this crisis. This crisis is not under management. I do not view the fact that Hezbollah has decided not to enter the war as the wisdom on the part of its leadership. It's more a question that the US has provided Israel with an edge, whether through satellite surveillance, whether through drones, to be able to void the value of that huge arsenal that Hezbollah had in terms of rockets. It still has surprises, but it's no longer able to mount a serious attack. But let's not remember what the leader of Hezbollah said. He said the knockout punch is not for today, which means the preparation for a knockout punch will continue, will be there. And therefore, the threat that Israel feels at an existential level is still there. And this, in my mind, is what pushes many in the administration and beyond to think, well, let's listen to the Israelis, even those who we have labeled right-wingers, in order to see what is it that they want. But what they want effectively is an Israel not unlike what Netanyahu showed the world when he said a new Middle East with a map of Israel that includes the West Bank and Gaza and does not include any Palestine. Actually,
right. So let me bring in Jeffrey Stacey.
Can I just jump in here, Francois, quickly?
Yeah, Jasmine El-Gamal, before Jeffrey Stacey. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in quickly because I do think it's important to separate and differentiate between sort of the really radical rhetoric that we're seeing from Israeli government officials about what they want to see in Palestine. I mean, they've made no secret. Multiple officials have said we want to evict everyone from Gaza. This is not occupied land. This is our biblical land. That's the Israeli government perspective. Now, I've been extremely critical for the last month of the U.S. government's diplomatic weakness and the actions that it appears to be condoning because it's not willing to pressure the Israelis as much as it could pressure them. But I do think it's just important to point out that the Biden administration officials, they don't want to see a mass displacement of Palestinians around the region. They do believe in a two-state solution, even though it seems so far from realistic right now. That's the tragic thing about this, is that they actually do believe that, but because of this failure in its diplomatic approach, because of this unequivocal public support for Israel, because of its lack of political will to put pressure on Israel behind closed doors, everyone in the region, everyone in the world is now looking at the United States and saying, well, you must believe what the Israelis are saying. You must support what the Israelis are doing. And that is what is going to reflect really badly and affect the U.S. standing in the region, in the world. I think the U.S. administration has done untold damage to its reputation and to its ability to broker future deals and be viewed as a credible actor in the region because of the way it's responded to this, regardless of what it thinks behind the scenes, which I would just argue that it's not as sort of nihilistic as the Israeli leadership has stated.
Right, undermining Antony Blinken's message while he was in the region, a far-right cabinet member of Benjamin Netanyahu's, who sparked outrage when he suggested that nuking Gaza was, quote, one option. The prime minister announced that the minister would later be suspended, but hours later, he joined a Sunday cabinet meeting by telephone. The damage that Jasmine El-Gamal is stating, Jeffrey Stacey, does it go away if Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer prime minister of Israel?
Well, I have to first disagree with my colleague. In fact, the United States is taking a much stronger stand in private than it is in public. That's why Blinken is there, taking a much stronger view. CQ Brown, our defense secretary, are on the line every day with their counterparts, every day, not every week, every day.
I did make that
so
point
she was
before
quite
you joined the program, though, just to point that out.
She is not. So let's get to the wider question here, which is, Francois, you're quite right to focus on the day after and also, where all of this is headed. And what we see now is effectively a non-strategy by the Israelis. They basically are going to run out of time quickly because the international community and the regional governments are working against them because of the extreme humanitarian cost. And so this is coming to a head sooner rather than later. And every day, the U.S. is warning the Israelis, you are about to lose the entire international community if you proceed with this non-strategy. They have a military strategy, but overall they do not have a political strategy. And in terms of who rules next, they refuse to answer the question because they don't have an answer to the question, and that's the overriding question of all.
Well, it brings us back to what the U.S.'s role is in all of this. Sinan Ulgen, your view on that day after that Antony Blinken's talking about, and seen from Turkey, how do you get to it?
Well, seen from Turkey, first of all, to be fair, Blinken, while he was in Ankara, also stated support for the two-state solution of this administration. Now, that needs to be spelled out much more clearly. We know that this has been the official position of this administration, but under these extreme circumstances, this needs to be said much more clearly and loudly, first of all. So from the Turkish perspective, there can be no other solution than a two-state solution, especially after now. Now, that still begs the question of what happens to Gaza. And obviously, there are a number of alternatives. One that's been, mooted by some members of the Israeli cabinet is an international administration, a UN-administered, zone. But that is not a long-term solution. That's not a sustainable solution. There has been past cases where we have seen a UN administration in other conflict areas, but Gaza cannot be that. So therefore, another possible solution is essentially to contemplate, to envisage whether al-Fatah can really control this territory. Now,
and we saw on that score the meeting between Antony Blinken and the Palestinian president this weekend.
Correct, absolutely. So that was discussed then. But obviously, we know that in recent memory that has not been possible. That al-Fatah lost its legitimacy in Gaza. It lost the political race to Hamas, and whether whether it can ever regain that ground is an open question. But obviously, this would provide a satisfactory solution. If this can happen and if the governance of Gaza can indeed be controlled by a Palestinian authority, that would essentially provide for a long-term and lasting solution. But that needs to be built up. And I think this is where a roadmap where not only the US, but regional countries can also contribute is going to be very critical going forward. And part of that roadmap could also include what Ankara has proposed, which is a security arrangement for Palestine, so that what we've seen since the 7th of October will not happen again.
Hassan Menemine, you heard earlier Jeffrey Stacey talking about how this is not tenable to keep on going like this when it comes to with the number of the loss in civilian life. That has to come to a head sooner rather than later. But if it doesn't, what is it?
Here are two important points in that respect. Yes, absolutely. Whether it is President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, there are a lot of statements that we hear from the United States underlining the fact that there needs to be respect for the law of war, for international humanitarian law, for international law, etc. Or else, nothing. What we have is a US position that says we support Israel 100% irrespective, and then we wish, we hope, we invite, we would like Israel to do, we'll state it in very strong terms, but behind closed doors. But actually, there is no action. There cannot be an action taken. And actually, I'll go beyond that. And that's the second point that is crucially important.
There cannot be an action taken.
There will not be an action taken. It's impossible at so many levels, the most important of which is that we have an election year coming. Just imagine Joe Biden nudging Benjamin Netanyahu in any direction. He would be devoured by all the Republican contestants to becoming to his rival in the election. virtually impossible for not just for this reason, but I would argue, I mean, and that's the second point that's important. Yes, I mean, the US would like this rather fictional, rather fuzzy, rather whatever it is, arrangement post-war, okay, with the Palestinian Authority, which actually has proven over 2 decades that it's incapable of being anything. It doesn't have support or ability to do anything in the West Bank. So how can we expect it to be able to do something that it has failed to do in Gaza, failed to do in the West Bank? All of a sudden, it's going to be able to achieve. Let's be clear about it. Israel has explicit goals and implicit goals. The explicit, and actually they're coherent, they're consistent. Israel would like to get rid of Hamas, would like to get rid of any possibility of a repeat of what happens on October 7th, and would like to pass on the responsibility of the upkeep of Hamas to something other than the order that was before. Okay, given that these are not achievable. I mean, let's be frank about it. I'm not talking about getting rid of Hamas. Getting rid of Hamas, it might be able to do, but at what cost? I mean, if we count today that we have what? Close to 10,000 dead in Gaza. Out of those, let's be generous and say 2,000 are Hamas. So 5 times the number of civilians have to die for Hamas to be eliminated. Hamas, by Israeli count, is about 30 to 40,000. You do the math. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people to be killed.
Jeffrey Stacey, you agree that...
Let me underline here that the fuzziness at the end is for Israel to be able to say, now it's your problem. So if there's a catastrophe in South Gaza, it's not going to be Israel's problem. It's going to be the US and the rest of the world's problem, and the solution to it is to move them out.
Jeffrey Stacey, do you agree that Benjamin Netanyahu has Joe Biden over a barrel?
In a way, yes, but I would put it slightly differently. I think his own days are numbered in Israeli politics, which is part of the question that you asked earlier, Francois. So that is something that will be dealt with later, more immediately. I think what we're
But later could be a long time away.
Yes, well, it depends on the Israeli public. I mean, already he's absolutely capsized in the polling in Israel. And most people look at him as a political, I hate this. These are not the right words, but I was going to say dead man walking. I don't mean it. That would not be correct language in the current context, but you understand where I'm going. The related question is what my colleague just mentioned in terms of what happens now. And remember, the Palestinian Authority was run out militarily by Hamas the last time. And Mahmoud Abbas said he did not want to re-enter Gaza on top of an Israeli tank. So what we need is an international trusteeship that would involve the UN, the US, Turkey, Qatar, a number of regional actors who will literally have to strike a ceasefire deal that will somehow go outside of Hamas to the Palestinian people, have them actually vote. Will you accept the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas back in? And then somehow, even then, we probably are going to have to get lucky, because sooner rather than later, as we have already spoken of, this is coming to a head, and the outcry is only going to grow. The political future for Netanyahu is only going to get worse. And remember where we were right before all of this started. He was being protested weekly, if not daily. And his corruption trial was proceeding. So we have a situation where, yes, Biden can't go all out in public the way that he probably feels in private. We know that, the bombing of the refugee camp this week in northern Gaza, he took that very personally and adversely. So that pressure from the U.S. is very strong. It will get stronger.
Jasmine El-Gamal, you agree?
I don't know how much more, I don't know how much more needs to happen in order for the U.S. to apply, quote unquote, stronger pressure. I'm not sure, to Jeffrey's point, what is the moment when the U.S. is going to finally apply this, magical strong pressure that it hasn't applied so far, with over 10,000 people killed and the roots of massive instability just being sowed in the region right now. I want to just very quickly talk about when we talk about what happens next and whether what U.S. pressure, if it increases, what it can lead to. The fight against Hamas and Hamas is more than an organization. Hamas is a terrorist organization, to be sure. Hamas is also representative of an idea, a belief that armed resistance is the only way to address an occupation. Now, the reason that will continue to be a source of grievance is because there is no room for a political solution in the form of the PA or any other nonviolent organization. Now, to be very accurate and go back to when Hamas and the PA were fighting in Gaza, we have to remember that Hamas won elections that were disregarded, the results of which were disregarded by the U.S., by Israel, and then the U.S. actually supported or tried to support the PA to overturn the results of those elections. So it wasn't just that Hamas sort of kicked the PA out of Gaza for no reason after it won the elections. There was, and the reason I mentioned that, though, is because I really want us to be careful about remembering and assigning responsibility and culpability when we talk about the responsibility of Israel and the U.S. to put forth a political solution, to allow for Palestinians to have hope for a better future. They have failed to do so in the past, and they're failing to do so now in the way that Israel is conducting this operation. With every day that goes forth, as we're seeing, it makes it harder and harder to go to
We're unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Jasmine Al-Gamal. How to find a nonviolent solution is something we'll be talking about in upcoming editions. I want to thank as well Sinan Ulgan for being with us from Istanbul, Jeffrey Stacey in Washington, Hassan Mene also in the U.S. Capitol. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.